There's a kind of love out there that looks like love, it feels like love, it even pretends to be love, but it isn't. It's a psychological trap, so sophisticated that most people go their entire lives without even realizing they're caught in it. Carl Jung, one of the greatest psychologists in history, he uncovered something deeply disturbing about how narcissists develop. And it doesn't start with obvious abuse. It doesn't begin with visible neglect. It starts with something that seems like the exact opposite. It starts with affection, but affection that comes with conditions. Imagine a child who only receives love when they behave in a certain way, when they smile at the right time, when they get good grades, when they don't cause trouble, when they don't cry, when they perform exactly as their parents want them to. That child is being programmed, and that programming is devastating because the child can't distinguish between genuine love and conditional control. To them, love means doing something to deserve it. Love means performing. Love means never simply being who you are. Love means always having to prove you're worthy. This is the primary narcissistic wound, and it happens silently, without shouting, without violence. Just a smile when the child does what's wanted, and a cold absence when they dare to be themselves. Let me tell you about Emily. Emily was 6 years old when she first noticed it. She had just earned a gold star at school for a drawing she made. She ran home, bursting with excitement, and showed it to her mother. Her mother looked, smiled, and hugged Emily tightly. She said it was beautiful, said she was proud. Emily felt something she rarely felt. She felt like she existed, that she was real, that she had value. 2 weeks later, Emily came home crying. A classmate had been cruel to her. She needed comfort. She ran to her mother, but this time, her mother didn't hug her, didn't smile. Her mother told Emily to stop being dramatic, said she was too old to cry like that, said she needed to learn to solve her own problems. Emily stopped crying, not because the pain went away, but because she learned that certain emotions were not allowed. At 6 years old, Emily was already internally divided. There was the Emily who received love, the one who earned gold stars and smiled at the right time. And there was the Emily who needed to disappear, the one who felt pain and fear and sadness. Jung called this division the splitting of the self, and from that split, everything changes. 32 years later, Emily was in therapy, professionally successful, married for 8 years, 2 children, seemingly. Everything was working. But Emily couldn't receive love from her husband. When he was affectionate for no reason, she became suspicious. When he praised her, she dismissed it. When he tried to comfort her in difficult moments, she shut down completely. Because inside Emily, there still existed that 6-year-old girl who learned that affection comes with conditions. And if her husband was affectionate without asking for anything, something was wrong. There had to be a hidden agenda. The demand would come later. She spent her entire life waiting for the other part of the contract that didn't exist. And it was slowly destroying the marriage. Her husband felt rejected. Emily felt incapable, and neither of them understood what was happening. The wound of conditional affection doesn't heal on its own. It transforms into a life pattern. Today I'm going to reveal the 5 invisible mechanisms that transform conditional affection into a psychological prison. I'm going to show how this wound creates the false self that then dominates adult life, and I'm going to explain what Jung discovered about how to break this cycle before it destroys another generation. If you recognize these patterns, stick around until the end, because the most important revelation comes in the last few minutes. The first invisible mechanism is what Jung called selective mirroring. Children need mirroring. They need to see in their parents' eyes that they exist. that they are real, that they have value. This is fundamental to the development of the true self. Without adequate mirroring, the child literally cannot form a solid identity. Jung studied this extensively. He observed that the mother functions as the child's first psychological mirror. In the mother's eyes, the child discovers who they are. If the mother looks with unconditional love, the child develops a sense of solid self. If the mother looks with conditional approval, the child develops a fragmented self. But parents who love conditionally do something cruel. They offer mirroring, but they only mirror certain parts of the child, the parts they like, the parts they want to see, the parts that don't cause trouble. When the child shows joy that is convenient for the parent, they are mirrored. When they show sadness, anger, or fear, they are ignored. Or worse, they are punished for having those emotions. What happens then is terrifying. The child begins to believe that only some parts of them are real. Only some parts deserve to exist. The other parts, the inconvenient emotions, the needs that bother, the desires that don't please the parents. All of this goes into the shadow, and in the shadow, these parts don't die. They become autonomous. They take on a life of their own. They start to sabotage adult life in ways that the person never understands. Jung wrote extensively about how repressed content in childhood becomes autonomous complexes. They function like secondary personalities within the psyche. And the more they are denied, the more power they gain. I'll give you a concrete example. Ethan, 45 years old, a successful executive. Since childhood, he learned that anger was not allowed. When he felt angry, his mother would get sad. She said he was hurting her. That good children don't feel angry. Ethan buried his anger in the shadow. He never felt angry again, never argued with anyone. He was the most peaceful person you could meet, but the anger didn't disappear. It became an autonomous complex. And this complex manifested in ways that Ethan didn't recognize. He had chronic stomach problems, insomnia, constant muscle tension in his neck and shoulders, 2 failed marriages, because his wives said he was emotionally unavailable. The anger he consciously denied was destroying his body and his relationships unconsciously. When he finally entered therapy and was confronted with the repressed anger, Ethan cried for the first time in decades, not from sadness, from relief. Finally, the part that had been banished to the shadow could exist. Recent studies confirm exactly this. Researchers published in 2023 that children exposed to conditional affection develop what they call introjected regulation. They internalize the conditions for receiving love and begin to apply those conditions to themselves. They no longer need their parents to feel inadequate. They do this to themselves. That inner critic that so many adults carry around didn't just appear out of thin air. It was planted through selective mirroring. The second mechanism is intermittent reinforcement. This is even more devastating than the total absence of affection because it creates dependence. Parents who offer conditional affection aren't cold all the time. They have moments of warmth, moments of approval, moments when the child feels loved. But these moments are unpredictable. They depend on something the child did or didn't do. The child never knows when they're going to receive affection. So, they remain in a permanent state of alert, trying to crack the code, trying to understand what they need to do to trigger their parents' affection. And this creates a pattern that lasts a lifetime. Researchers have studied this phenomenon in the laboratory. They discovered that intermittent rewards create a much stronger dependence than consistent rewards. It's exactly the mechanism of slot machines. You never know when you're going to win, so you keep trying. The same thing happens with children exposed to intermittent affection. They develop a sort of addiction to seeking approval. Even when they receive consistent affection from other people later in life, they can't relax. Something feels fake. Something feels too easy. Adults who were exposed to intermittent reinforcement in childhood repeat the pattern in relationships. They feel more attracted to unpredictable people. They confuse anxiety with passion. They confuse uncertainty with intensity. They become addicted to the search for approval. That is never guaranteed. Carl Jung identified this pattern as a form of repetition compulsion. The person unconsciously recreates the conditions of childhood, trying to finally resolve the original problem, but they never resolve it. Because they're using the same strategy that failed when they were a child. Emily was 38 years old when she recognized the pattern. 3 long-term relationships, all with emotionally unavailable men. When she finally met a stable, caring man who loved her consistently, she felt that something was missing. There was no drama. There was no uncertainty. There wasn't that feeling of chasing something that runs away. Emily almost ended the relationship because it seemed boring. It was only in therapy that she understood that what she called boredom was actually security. And security was something that her nervous system didn't recognize as affection. Emily's father was like that. Moments of intense affection followed by long absences. She spent her childhood trying to figure out how to make her father stay. And in adulthood, she repeated the pattern. She sought men who replicated the dynamic. Men who needed to be won over, repeatedly. Men whose affection was never guaranteed. The healing came when Emily managed to tolerate the discomfort of security, when she learned to recognize that consistent affection was not false affection. It was real affection, the only type of affection that she had never known. The third mechanism is subtle invalidation. It's not the obvious invalidation. It's not the father who yells. It's something much more insidious. It's the parent who listens to the child talk about a problem and immediately offers a solution, without first validating that the problem exists, without first acknowledging that the child is feeling something. It's the mother who says, "I love you," but then immediately adds a criticism. "I love you, but you need to improve in this area. I love you, but you disappoint me when you do that." It's the affection that always comes with an agenda. The hug that has a purpose. The compliment that's followed by a request. The child learns that they can never simply receive. There is always a cost. There's always a hidden condition. There's always something that they need to do in return. Carl Jung spoke about this when he described how complexes form every time the child has an emotional experience that isn't recognized by the environment. That experience goes to the unconscious. It doesn't disappear, it stays there, kind of waiting. And when it accumulates enough material, it becomes an autonomous complex. Subtle invalidation creates complexes of inadequacy. The child isn't explicitly rejected. They're subtly taught that their emotions, their needs, their true self, are not important enough to be recognized. And this creates a devastating inability in adulthood. The inability to receive unconditional affection. Because even when someone offers affection without conditions, the person who was raised with subtle invalidation can't believe it. They keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the demand, waiting for the but. Ethan was 42 years old, married for the second time. His first wife left him saying that he was impossible to please. Ethan didn't understand. He thought that he was the one who couldn't please others. In therapy, Ethan discovered something important. Every time his wife did something affectionate, he disqualified it. She cooked something special. He found fault with it. She planned a surprise and he criticized some detail. She said she loved him. He doubted it. Ethan didn't do this consciously. It was automatic. It was the voice of his mother that lived inside him. The mother who always said, "I love you," but the mother whose affection was never free. The mother who taught Ethan that you can't simply receive, you have to pay. And Ethan paid by disqualifying the affection he received. Because if he accepted the affection, he would have a debt. And Ethan learned in childhood that emotional debts are dangerous. Ethan's healing came when he managed, for the first time, to say, "Thank you," and stop. Without adding a but, without finding a fault, without creating a safety distance. It seemed strange at first, like being naked, vulnerable, exposed, but over time, Ethan learned that receiving affection didn't create debt. It created connection. Some people sabotage healthy relationships for exactly this reason. They can't stand the anxiety of waiting for the bill to come, so they provoke the conflict themselves. At least that way, they have control over when the pain will arrive. The fourth mechanism is what I call transactional affection. It's when parents treat the relationship with the child like a business transaction. I do this for you. You do this for me. I give you a house, food, clothing, and you owe me obedience, gratitude, performance. This seems reasonable to many parents. After all, they're doing a lot for the child. Isn't it fair to expect something in return? But the child didn't ask to be born. The child didn't sign a contract. The child came into the world expecting unconditional affection, because that's what children need to develop healthily. When affection is treated as a transaction, the child learns something terrible about themselves. They learn that they have no intrinsic value. Their value is only utilitarian. They're worth what they produce, worth what they do for others, worth nothing for simply existing. And this is the basis of the narcissistic wound. Narcissism, as Carl Jung explained, isn't an excess of self-love. It's the absence of it. It's a desperate attempt to compensate for the emptiness left by never having been loved unconditionally. The grandiose narcissist inflates themselves because deep down, they feel worthless. The covert narcissist hides and seeks constant validation because they never believed they were enough. Both are strategies to survive the wound of having been treated like a commodity. Ethan is a perfect example. He grew up in a family where everything was accounted for. When his father paid for school, he regularly reminded Ethan of the sacrifice. When his mother cooked, she expected explicit gratitude. Whenever they did something for Ethan, they created an emotional debt that he needed to repay. Ethan learned to keep score too. Every kindness had a price. Every favor created an obligation. There was nothing free. In Ethan's emotional universe, at 35, Ethan was incapable of giving without expecting something in return, incapable of receiving without feeling indebted. His relationships were transactions. His friendships were business deals. His marriage was a balance sheet of who owed what to whom. And when his wife said she just wanted him to love her without demanding anything, Ethan didn't understand. What did it mean to love without demanding? For him, that didn't exist. Love always had a cost. Love always had a contract. Love was always a transaction. Ethan's therapy was long. He needed to unlearn everything he knew about love. He needed to learn that giving doesn't create debt in others. He needed to learn that receiving doesn't create debt in himself. He needed to learn that true love isn't an exchange, it's presence. The fifth mechanism is generational transmission. This is perhaps the most tragic of all. Parents who offer conditional affection were usually raised with conditional affection themselves. They don't know any other way to love. For them, this is normal. This is how it works. And the child who receives this affection grows up and does the same thing with their own children. Not out of malice, not intentionally, out of pure unconscious programming. Jung called these inherited autonomous complexes. They're patterns that pass from generation to generation without ever being questioned. The entire family functions within this system, and anyone who tries to leave is seen as a traitor. Jung also spoke about mystical participation. This is the period of early childhood, from 0 to 7 years old, when the child lives in psychological fusion with their parents. There is no separation. The child absorbs everything, the fears, the complexes, the wounds, the defenses, as if they were their own. And that's how conditional affection is transmitted. Not through words, through presence, through the quality of attention, through micro-expressions that the child absorbs even before they can speak. Researchers confirm this. Studies show that children of narcissistic parents are more likely to develop narcissistic or codependent traits. The cycle repeats until someone wakes up. Emily woke up when her daughter was born, at 38. Emily found herself doing to her daughter exactly what her mother had done to her. She smiled when the baby was quiet. She got tense when she cried. She gave attention when the baby was good. She withdrew emotionally when the baby demanded. Emily didn't want to do this, but it was automatic. It was the only model she knew. Emily's terror was that she was creating another generation of people incapable of receiving love. Another generation who would think affection had a price. Another generation who would never know what it meant to be loved unconditionally. This terror is what drove Emily to therapy. And the therapy was brutal. Emily needed to confront everything her mother had done. She needed to feel the anger. She'd never allowed herself to feel. She needed to grieve for the childhood she didn't have. She needed to forgive her mother without minimizing the wound, and little by little, Emily began to do things differently with her daughter. She began to welcome the crying. Instead of withdrawing, she began to give attention, even when her daughter wasn't doing anything special. She began to say, "I love you," without adding a but. Each time. It was a conscious effort. Each time. It was fighting against the programming. But with time, it became more natural. And Emily realized something important. By healing her daughter, she was healing herself too. By giving the affection she never received, she was filling the void she carried. There's another aspect of generational transmission that Jung identified. It's the unconscious participation in the family complex. Families with conditional affection develop unspoken rules, ways of being that everyone follows without question, roles that each member plays, and anyone who tries to step outside these roles faces resistance from the entire system. The child who starts questioning the pattern is often seen as the problem. They're the black sheep, the one who doesn't fit in, the one who makes drama, but in reality, this child is often the healthiest in the system. They're the only one who managed to realize that something is wrong. They're the only one who refused to normalize the abnormal. Jung called this the transcendent function of the symptomatic member. The person who appears to be the problem is often the one who is trying to wake up the family, and is attacked exactly for that reason. If you were that child, if you were seen as difficult, dramatic, too sensitive, there's a chance that you were the only one seeing clearly and paid the price for it. There's another case I need to tell you about. Daniel was 50 years old when he finally understood why he never felt at peace. He was the eldest of 3 children, the responsible one, the one who could never make mistakes, the one who had to set an example. From the age of 7, Daniel carried the weight of the family. His mother was always overwhelmed. His father worked too much, and Daniel, without anyone explicitly asking, assumed the role of a third adult. He took care of his siblings. He resolved conflicts. He didn't cause trouble. He never asked for anything. He was the perfect child, and he was loved for it, praised for it, recognized for it. But the affection that Daniel received had a terrible price tag. He had to disappear as a child to be loved. He had to be useful, to have value. He had to perform as an adult when he was still a boy, at 50 years old. Daniel was exhausted. He had spent his entire life taking care of others. First his siblings, then his wife, then his children, then his employees, then his elderly parents, and never had anyone asked Daniel what he needed. Because Daniel had learned in childhood that his needs didn't exist. There was only what he could do for others in therapy. Daniel needed to learn something that most children learn naturally, that he had the right to have needs. That asking for help wasn't weakness, that he could exist in without having to produce all the time. It was one of the most difficult processes he'd ever faced, because asking for something for himself triggered paralyzing guilt. That inner voice would whisper that he was being selfish, that he was abandoning others, that he was betraying the role he'd taken on. But gradually, Ethan learned to tolerate that guilt. He learned that the guilt was the voice of the complex, not the voice of truth. And he learned that taking care of himself wasn't selfishness. It was survival. Ethan still cares for others. It's part of who he is. But now, he also cares for himself. And that difference changed everything. And here is the hardest truth to accept. If you recognize these patterns in your childhood, you're probably repeating some of them now, not all of them. Maybe not in the same way. But the programming is there, running in the background, influencing choices you think are your own. The mother who was invalidated may invalidate her own children in subtle ways she doesn't even realize. The father who never received unconditional affection might place conditions on the love he offers his children without realizing he's doing it, not out of malice, out of repetition. But there is a way out. Carl Jung dedicated a significant portion of his work to explaining how to break these cycles. He called the process individuation, and it begins with a step that seems simple, but is extraordinarily difficult: recognition, not intellectually, not as an abstract concept. Recognize viscerally, in your body, in your emotions, the wound you carry. This means allowing yourself to feel the pain that was repressed in childhood, the pain of having been loved conditionally, the pain of having had to perform to receive affection, the pain of never having been enough, simply for existing. Many people resist this step because it hurts, because it feels like ingratitude, because their parents did so much. How can they complain? But Jung was clear. It's not about blaming, it's about seeing the truth. Your parents probably did the best they could within their own programming. That doesn't change the fact that the wound exists. Compassion for your parents and validation of your own pain can coexist. The second step is what Jung called confronting the shadow. Remember the parts that were selectively mirrored, the parts your parents didn't want to see. They're in the shadow, and they need to be rescued. This means allowing yourself to feel anger. When you feel anger, sadness. When you feel sadness, fear. When you feel fear, without judgment, without the voice of the internal critic telling you that you shouldn't feel this. It also means recognizing the parts of yourself that you deny, the desires that seem forbidden, the needs that seem shameful, the aspects of your personality that were banished to the shadow because your parents didn't approve. Integrating the shadow doesn't mean acting on every impulse. It means recognizing that they exist, giving them space. Stop spending energy repressing what is natural. The third step is reparenting. This term might sound strange, but the concept is simple. You can't change your parents. You can't go back in time and receive the unconditional love you needed. But you can give that love to yourself now. Reparenting means becoming the parent you needed to have. It means looking at yourself with the caring, the patience, and the acceptance that children deserve. When you make a mistake, instead of criticizing yourself harshly, you can ask yourself, how would I treat a child who made this mistake? And then, treat yourself that way. When you feel difficult emotions, instead of repressing them or judging yourself for having them, you can ask yourself, what would a child need to hear right now? And then say that to yourself. It seems simple, but for someone who was raised with conditional affection, it's revolutionary. It's the first time the person gives themselves permission to be imperfect and still be worthy of love. The fourth step is conscious choice. Jung emphasized that knowledge without action transforms nothing. You can intellectually understand all these mechanisms and still repeat them. Real change comes from different choices, repeated, even when the complex screams at you to return to the old pattern. This means, for example, choosing not to place conditions on the love you offer your children, even when the inner voice says they need to learn, even when the anxiety says you're spoiling them too much. It means choosing relationships where love isn't transactional, even when that feels strange, even when the absence of conditions creates discomfort. It means choosing to validate the emotions of others before offering solutions, even when your programming tells you to solve the problem immediately. Each micro-choice that's different weakens the old complex and strengthens the new pattern. It's not quick, it takes time, but it's possible. And here we arrive at the most important revelation. The wound of conditional affection isn't just personal, it's collective. Entire generations were raised this way. Entire societies function this way. The message that you need to produce to have value framework is everywhere. But there's another possibility. A way of loving that demands nothing in return. A way of existing that doesn't depend on performance. A way of being that simply is. Jung called this the self, the center of the psyche that exists before any conditioning. The part of you that was born whole, before anyone said you needed to be different, to deserve love. That part is still there, buried under layers of conditioning, but intact. The work of individuation is to unearth that part, clean the layers of false self that were built to survive, and allow the true self to finally live. It's not an easy job, but it's the only job that really matters, because when you free yourself from conditional affection, you also free everyone who comes after you, your children, their children, generations who will never know the prison you knew. That's the true cure, not just personal, generational. If you've made it this far, you've already taken the first step. You've recognized it. Now, the choice is yours. What are you going to do with it?